This photo of two friends appeared innocent until historians uncovered a hidden dark secret. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., receives donations nearly every day. Boxes of family photographs, documents, and artifacts arrive, each sent by people hoping to contribute to the preservation of Black history. James Rivera had been a curator there for 5 years, and in that time, he had seen thousands of images pass through his hands. Daguerreotypes of freedmen, portraits of civil rights activists, and snapshots of everyday life spanning generations. But on a humid September morning in 2024, he opened a box that made him stop and stare. The donation had come from an estate sale in Richmond, Virginia. An accompanying letter explained that the items once belonged to an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, who had passed away at 97 with no living relatives. Her home had been filled with historical documents and photographs, carefully preserved but never explained. The estate executor hoped the museum might find something of value among them. James lifted out a leather portfolio and opened it carefully. Inside, protected by layers of tissue paper, was a studio photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The photographer's mark read Anderson and Sons Photography, Richmond, Virginia, 1889. Two young men stood side by side in the image, both dressed in identical dark suits with high, collared white shirts and patterned ties. They were positioned before a painted backdrop depicting a library, with books lining the walls. A small table beside them held a vase of flowers and what appeared to be a Bible. The young man on the left was white, perhaps 22 or 23, with light hair neatly parted, and a handlebar mustache just beginning to take shape. His expression was serious yet warm, his eyes looking directly at the camera with confidence. The young man on the right was black, roughly the same age, with a strong jaw and intelligent eyes. His posture was equally upright, his clothing identical in quality and style to his companions. Most striking was the positioning. The white man's hand rested on the black man's shoulder, and the black man's hand reached across to grip his companion's forearm. It was an unmistakable gesture of friendship, even brotherhood, for a photograph taken in 1889 Virginia, just 24 years after the Civil War ended, at a time when Jim Crow laws were solidifying racial segregation across the South. This image was extraordinary. Interracial friendship certainly existed, but it was rarely documented so formally, so publicly. Studio portraits were expensive, deliberate affairs. People didn't commission them casually. James pulled out his magnifying glass and examined the photograph more closely. That was when he began to notice the details that didn't fit the simple narrative of friendship. The white man's hand on his companion's shoulder. Looking closer, James saw the fingers weren't resting gently, but gripping tightly, the knuckles slightly white from pressure. The black man's smile, which had seemed genuine at first glance, didn't quite reach his eyes. And his free hand, the one not gripping his friend's arm, was clenched into a fist at his side. James moved his magnifying glass across the background of the photograph. The painted backdrop showed a refined library, but in the lower right corner, partially obscured by the small table, something hung on the wall. He adjusted his desk lamp and leaned closer. It was a chain. Heavy links painted into the backdrop, incongruous with the elegant library setting. Why would a photography studio include a chain in a backdrop meant to suggest education and refinement? James turned the photograph over. The back of the mounting board was yellowed with age, but someone had written across it in faded brown ink. The handwriting was shaky, as if written quickly or under emotional duress. Thomas and Marcus. Last photograph before the departure. May God forgive us for what we have done. September 14, 1889. James read the inscription 3 times. Last photograph before the departure. Were they going somewhere together? separating. And that phrase, "May God forgive us for what we have done." Not what we must do or what we will do, but what we have done. Something had already happened when this photograph was taken, something that required divine forgiveness. He photographed the image from multiple angles, capturing every detail in high resolution. Then he opened his laptop and began to search. He needed to find out who Thomas and Marcus were, why they had posed for this photograph together in 1889 Virginia, and what dark secret was hidden in the tension beneath their posed friendship. The investigation had begun, and James had a feeling this photograph would reveal a story far more complex and painful than the simple portrait of friendship it appeared to be at first glance. James spent the rest of that day searching for any record of Thomas and Marcus from 1889 Richmond. Without last names, the search was difficult. Both names were common in that period. He started with the photographer's mark, Anderson and Sons Photography. Richmond city directories from the 1880s showed that Anderson and Sons had operated a studio on Broad Street from 1885 to 1893, advertising themselves as specialists in fine portraiture for distinguished families. The emphasis on distinguished families suggested they catered to Richmond's white elite, making the photograph of an interracial pair even more unusual. James examined the photograph again under different lighting conditions, looking for any other clues he might have missed. The suits both men wore were expensive, tailored, not ready-made. The fabric appeared to be fine wool, appropriate for a formal portrait. Their shoes, visible at the bottom of the frame, were polished leather. Everything about their presentation suggested wealth and status. But something about the black man's posture nagged at James. Despite the expensive clothing and confident stance, there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a guardedness in his expression, that spoke of someone who had learned to be careful, to watch and wait. James had seen similar expressions in photographs of freedmen from the Reconstruction era. People who had gained legal freedom, but still navigated a world designed to constrain them. He decided to approach the search differently. If these were distinguished families, there might be records in Richmond's historical archives, property records, court documents, newspaper mentions. He contacted his colleague Dr. Patricia Okoye, who taught African American history at Howard University and had extensive connections with archives throughout Virginia. Patricia called him back within 2 hours. "I'm intrigued," she said. "Can you send me high-resolution scans of the photograph? I want to look at it myself." James emailed her the images, and they arranged to meet the following day at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, where Patricia had already scheduled time to search through property records and newspaper archives from the 1880s and 1890s. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. He had handled thousands of historical images, but something about this one felt different. The inscription, "May God forgive us," suggested guilt, complicity, perhaps even crime. And that chain in the background, partially hidden but unmistakably there. Had the photographer included it deliberately? Or had it been part of the studio's standard backdrop, a detail that took on sinister meaning only in the context of who was being photographed? He pulled up census records from 1890, searching for any Thomas and Marcus listed in the same household in Richmond or the surrounding counties. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed by fire, but fragments remained. After 2 hours of searching, he found an entry that made his pulse quicken. In Henrico County, just outside Richmond, the 1880 census listed a Thomas Whitmore, age 13, living with his parents, William and Elizabeth Whitmore. William's occupation was listed as planter, the term used for large-scale farmers, often former plantation owners. The household included several people listed as servants, and among them was a boy named Marcus, age 13, with no last name given. His race was marked as colored. James sat back, his mind racing. In 1880, 15 years after the end of slavery, census records still often listed black workers without full names or with only first names. A holdover from slavery, when enslaved people had no legal surnames. If this was the same Marcus from the photograph, he would have been around 22 or 23 in 1889, matching the apparent age of the man in the portrait. And Thomas Whitmore would have been the same age, having grown up in the same household as Marcus. James searched for more information about the Whitmore family. William Whitmore appeared in multiple records, property deeds, tax records, mentions in Richmond newspapers related to agricultural associations. The family had owned a substantial plantation called Oakwood, about 15 miles outside Richmond before the war. After the war, they had retained the property, though records showed it had been reduced in size. What had happened to Marcus? Had he remained with the Whitmore family after emancipation? And if so, under what circumstances? The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in 1865, but James knew that many formerly enslaved people had remained with their former owners, bound by economic necessity, exploitative labor contracts, or outright intimidation. He needed to see the property records, labor contracts, and any legal documents related to the Whitmore family. He needed to understand the relationship between Thomas and Marcus, whether they had genuinely been friends, as the photograph suggested, or whether something darker lay beneath the surface of their posed companionship. James looked at the photograph one more time before closing his laptop. Two young men, dressed identically, hands on each other in gestures of connection. But the tension in Marcus's fist, the too tight grip of Thomas's hand, the chain in the background, all of it whispered of a story far from simple friendship. Tomorrow, in Richmond, he would begin to uncover the truth. The Library of Virginia occupied a modern building near Capitol Square in Richmond, its collections preserving centuries of the state's history, including the uncomfortable truths of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial violence. James met Patricia in the research room early Wednesday morning, and they requested records for Henrico County from 1860 through 1900, focusing on property deeds, court documents, and labor contracts. The archivist brought them boxes of documents, and they divided the work. Patricia took the property records while James focused on court files and legal contracts. Within an hour, Patricia found the Whitmore family's property history. The plantation was called Oakwood, she said, spreading out a surveyor's map from 1858, one's 200 acres. William Whitmore inherited it from his father in 1867, right after the war. The 1860 slave schedule shows the family owned 43 enslaved people. James felt the familiar weight that came with reading such documents, each number representing a human life, a stolen identity, generations of trauma. Do we have names? The slave schedules only list ages and gender, not names. But look at this. Patricia pulled out another document. This is the 1870 census, the first one after emancipation. William Whitmore is still at Oakwood, but now he has employees instead of enslaved people. And here, she pointed to a line, Marcus Freeman, age 16. Laborer. A freeman. Marcus had taken a surname after emancipation, claiming his freedom through his name. But he had remained at Oakwood, working for the family that had once owned him. James searched through the court records and found what he was looking for. Labor contracts filed with Henrico County between 1866 and 1885. He pulled out the file for 1866 and began reading. The contracts were supposedly voluntary agreements between freedmen and their former owners, establishing terms of employment after slavery ended. But as James read through them, he saw how easily such contracts could become tools of continued bondage. The terms were exploitative, Workers agreed to year-long contracts with minimal wages, often paid in scrip that could only be used at the plantation store. If they left before the contract ended, they could be arrested for breach of contract and forced to return. Any debts to the employer for housing, food, or clothing were deducted from wages, ensuring workers remained perpetually indebted. He found Marcus's contract dated January 1866. Marcus Freeman, approximately 14 years old, agreed to work for William Whitmore for 1 year in exchange for room, board, and $5 per month. The contract stated that Marcus owed William Whitmore $2 for care and sustenance, provided during the transition from slavery to freedom. At $5 per month, it would take Marcus 4 months just to pay off that manufactured debt. James flipped through the years. 1867, another contract, similar terms. 1868, same. 1869, 1870, 1871. Year after year, Marcus Freeman signed contracts binding him to the Whitmore plantation. Or perhaps, signed wasn't accurate. Many of the contracts bore only an X next to Marcus's name, suggesting he couldn't write or had been prevented from learning. "This is peonage," Patricia said quietly, reading over his shoulder. "Legal slavery under a different name." James nodded grimly. Peonage, the practice of binding workers through debt, had been officially outlawed by Congress in 1867, but the law was rarely enforced in the South. Thousands of black workers remained trapped in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, bound by contracts, debt, and the threat of violence. But the contract stopped in 1885. After that year, James found no record of Marcus Freeman signing any labor agreement with William Whitmore. Had Marcus finally escaped? Or had something else happened? He pulled out newspaper archives from the Richmond Dispatch, searching for any mention of the Whitmore family or Oakwood plantation. Patricia searched the Henrico County Court records for any legal proceedings involving the family. It was Patricia who found the first clue. "James, look at this. It's a civil case filed in September 1889. William Whitmore versus Thomas Whitmore, a property dispute." James moved to her side. The case file was thin, just a few pages, but the header indicated it had been filed on September 10th, 1889, 4 days before the photograph was taken. The complaint was written in the formal legal language of the period, but its meaning was clear. William Whitmore was accusing his son Thomas of attempting to steal property that rightfully belonged to the family estate. The specific property wasn't detailed in the filing, only described as human chattel unlawfully retained. "A human chattel," James said softly. "In 1889, 24 years after the 13th Amendment." Patricia pointed to another line. "And look at this." Thomas filed a counterclaim the same day. He accused his father of maintaining illegal peonage contracts and claimed he had evidence of fraud and coercion. James felt pieces clicking into place. Thomas Whitmore had discovered what his father was doing. He had found evidence that Marcus Freeman, and possibly others, were being held in illegal bondage through fraudulent contracts and debt manipulation. And Thomas had decided to act, to testify against his own father. That would explain the inscription on the photograph. "May God forgive us for what we have done." Thomas had betrayed his father. He had chosen his friend over his family, justice over loyalty. But what had happened next? The case file showed the initial complaint and counterclaim, but nothing more. No trial date, no resolution, no verdict. James searched the newspaper archives for September and October 1889, looking for any mention of the Whitmore case. He found nothing. No trial announcements, no reports of testimony, no scandal. For a prominent family like the Whitmores, the absence of coverage was suspicious. Then Patricia found something in the November 1889 papers, a brief obituary tucked on an inside page. Thomas William Whitmore, age 23, died suddenly on October 2, 1889, at his family home in Henrico County. He is survived by his father, William Whitmore, and mother, Elizabeth Whitmore. Services will be private. The family requests no visitors. James read it twice. Thomas had died less than 3 weeks after the photograph was taken. Less than a month after filing his counterclaim against his father. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. We need to find out how he died, James said. And we need to find out what happened to Marcus. The James and Patricia requested death certificates for Henrico County from October 1889. The clerk brought them a ledger book, its pages brittle and yellowed. James found Thomas Whitmore's entry dated October 2nd, 1889. The cause of death was listed as accidental shooting. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Harrison. The informant who reported the death was William Whitmore, father of the deceased. Accidental shooting, Patricia said skeptically. 3 weeks after he accused his father of illegal peonage. James photographed the page. We need to find the coroner's report, if there was one, and any newspaper coverage of the death. They returned to the newspaper archives, this time searching specifically for Thomas Whitmore's death. In the October 4, 1889 edition of the Richmond Dispatch, they found a longer article. Tragedy at Oakwood Plantation. Young Thomas Whitmore, son of respected planter William Whitmore, died Tuesday evening in what authorities are calling an unfortunate hunting accident. According to Sheriff Martin Crawford, young Whitmore was cleaning a rifle when it discharged, striking him in the chest. He died within minutes. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the family physician, confirmed the death as accidental. The family is said to be devastated by the loss of their only son. The article continued with praise for the Whitmore family's standing in the community, William's service on various boards, and expressions of sympathy from neighbors. There was no mention of the pending legal case between father and son. This is a cover-up, Patricia said flatly. A prominent family loses their son in a hunting accident, just as he's about to expose his father in court. The sheriff calls it accidental before any investigation. The family physician signs off on it, and somehow the newspapers never mention the legal dispute. James agreed, but proving it more than a century later would be difficult. They needed to find people who had witnessed what happened. Servants, workers, neighbors who might have written letters or kept diaries. And they needed to find Marcus Freeman. He had been at the center of Thomas's accusations. He must have known the truth about what happened at Oakwood. If Marcus had survived, if he had left any record, it might hold the answers they needed. James searched for Marcus Freeman in records after 1889. The 1890 census was destroyed, but the 1900 census might show where Marcus had ended up. He pulled up the digital archives and began searching Virginia, then expanding to neighboring states. He found nothing. No Marcus Freeman of the right age anywhere in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, or West Virginia in the 1900 census. It was as if Marcus had vanished after that photograph was taken. Could he have died too? Patricia asked. Maybe William Whitmore killed both of them. Or maybe Marcus escaped, James said. Thomas was trying to free him. Maybe he succeeded before he died. Maybe Marcus ran and changed his name to avoid being tracked. Patricia pulled out her phone. I'm going to contact the African American Genealogy Network. They specialize in tracing families through the post-emancipation period, when records get spotty. If Marcus survived and had descendants, they might be able to find them. While Patricia made calls, James continued searching through Henrico County records. He found property transfers for Oakwood Plantation. William Whitmore had sold portions of the land in 1891 and 1893, suggesting possible financial difficulties. He found tax records, business licenses, and mundane legal filings. But nothing about the case between father and son, nothing about what had really happened in September and October of 1889. Then he found something unexpected, a probate record from 1912. William Whitmore had died at age 78, and his estate was being settled. The probate included an inventory of property, debts, and assets. Among the debts listed was a curious entry. Outstanding legal settlement, Freeman matter, $500. James stared at the entry. 23 years after Thomas's death, William Whitmore's estate still acknowledged an unresolved legal matter involving someone named Freeman. $500 in 1912 was a substantial sum, roughly equivalent to $15,000 in 2024. What was this settlement for? He searched for any related documents but found nothing. The Freeman matter remained unexplained, a cryptic reference in an old man's probate file. Patricia returned with news. I spoke with Dr. Raymond Cole at the Freedmen's Bureau Project. He's going to search their database for any Marcus Freeman who might have relocated after 1889. They have records from black churches, mutual aid societies, and freedmen's schools that sometimes fill in gaps when census data is missing. James showed her the probate entry. Look at this. William Whitmore owed money related to a Freeman matter when he died in 1912. A settlement, Patricia said thoughtfully. Maybe Thomas did free Marcus before he died. Maybe William had to pay Marcus as part of settling the legal case. Pay him back wages. Compensate him for years of illegal peonage. But why would that still be outstanding in 1912? Maybe Marcus was never found to receive the payment. Or maybe William fought it in court for years, and it wasn't resolved until after his death. James felt they were circling something important. A truth buried under layers of legal maneuvering and family secrets. The photograph showed Thomas and Marcus together. Two young men whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. Thomas had tried to free his friend from his own father's exploitation. But something had gone terribly wrong. They needed to find Marcus Freeman's story, where he had gone after 1889, whether he had ever received justice, whether he had survived to tell his version of what happened at Oakwood Plantation. 3 days later, Dr. Raymond Cole called James with the first break in Marcus Freeman's trail. I found him, Raymond said, excitement evident in his voice. Or at least, I found someone who matches the profile. In 1891, a man named Marcus Freeman joined the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. The membership roll lists him as 24 years old, originally from Virginia, employed as a carpenter. Philadelphia, James repeated, already pulling up his laptop. That's a long way from Richmond. That's what makes me think it's him, Raymond said. A lot of freedmen headed north to escape the South, especially if they were running from dangerous situations. Philadelphia had a strong black community, good employment opportunities, and most importantly, it was far enough from Virginia that a formerly enslaved person could start fresh. Raymond sent James digital copies of the church records. The entry for Marcus Freeman was brief, admitted to membership on April 12, 1891 by profession of faith. The handwriting was neat, the record routine, but it meant Marcus had survived whatever happened at Oakwood. He had escaped, traveled hundreds of miles north, and begun rebuilding his life. James searched Philadelphia city directories from the 1890s. In the 1892 directory, he found Marcus Freeman listed as a carpenter, residing at 712 South Street in the heart of Philadelphia's black neighborhood. By 1895, the same Marcus Freeman was listed as owning a small carpentry business on Lombard Street. He made it, James said to Patricia when he called her with the news. Marcus got out and built a life for himself. That's remarkable, Patricia said. But I want to know how he escaped and what he knew about Thomas Whitmore's death. James continued his search through Philadelphia records. In 1896, Marcus Freeman married a woman named Sarah Johnson at First Baptist Church. The marriage record listed Marcus as 30 years old, born in Virginia, both parents deceased. It was common for formerly enslaved people to list their parents as deceased, even if they didn't know their fate. Slavery had broken so many families apart that reunification was often impossible. The 1900 census showed Marcus and Sarah Freeman living on South Street with 2 young children. Marcus's occupation was listed as carpenter and contractor. He had clearly prospered, moving from wage labor to business ownership in less than a decade. But the real discovery came when James searched Philadelphia newspaper archives. In the October 15, 1899 edition of the Philadelphia Tribune, a black newspaper, he found an article that made his hands shake. Local businessman shares story of escape from Peonage. The article began, Mr. Marcus Freeman, respected carpenter and member of our community, spoke Thursday evening at the Mother Bethel AMEM Church about his experiences under illegal peonage in Virginia following the war. Mr. Freeman's testimony offered a sobering reminder that the fight for true freedom continues decades after emancipation. James read the article 3 times. Marcus had gone public with his story. He had stood before a church congregation and told them what had happened at Oakwood Plantation. The article didn't provide details of his testimony, only summarizing that Marcus had described years of forced labor, fraudulent contracts, and violence used to keep workers from leaving. It mentioned that he had escaped, with the help of a friend who paid the ultimate price for his conscience. A friend who paid the ultimate price. Thomas Whitmore. James searched for more mentions of Marcus Freeman in Philadelphia newspapers and found several. Marcus had become an advocate for labor rights, speaking at churches and community meetings about the ongoing exploitation of black workers in the South. In 1902, he testified before a congressional committee investigating peonage and convict leasing systems. James found the congressional testimony in the Library of Congress archives. Marcus Freeman's testimony, given on March 6, 1902, was 15 pages long. James began reading, and the story that emerged was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Marcus testified that he had been born enslaved at Oakwood Plantation around 1866. After emancipation, when he was approximately 14 years old, William Whitmore had forced him to sign a labor contract. Marcus couldn't read, and no one explained the terms. He later learned the contract bound him for a year and claimed he owed Whitmore money for his care. Each year, Whitmore presented a new contract. Each year, Marcus was told he still owed money for food, housing, clothing, tools. The amounts were arbitrary and always exceeded his wages. When Marcus tried to leave in 1874 at age 18, Whitmore had him arrested for breach of contract and debt. The local sheriff, who was Whitmore's friend, brought Marcus back to Oakwood in chains. I was free by law, Marcus testified, but a prisoner in fact. Mr. Whitmore kept me and others like me through fear. He said if we ran, he would find us and see us hanged for theft. He said no one would believe a colored man over a white landowner. Marcus described years of his existence, working from dawn to dusk, never able to save money, never able to leave. Other workers came and went, but Marcus remained trapped by circumstances and by Whitmore's threats. Then, in 1888, something changed. Thomas Whitmore, who had been away at the University of Virginia, returned home. Thomas and Marcus had grown up together, not as equals, but with a relationship closer than typical enslaver and enslaved. Thomas's mother, Elizabeth, had taught both boys to read, though secretly in Marcus's case. They had played together as children before the reality of their different positions became unbridgeable. Thomas was shocked to discover that Marcus was still at Oakwood, still bound by contracts, still unpaid for his labor. He began investigating his father's business practices and discovered the truth. William Whitmore had been operating an illegal peonage system for years, keeping Marcus and several other workers in bondage through fraudulent contracts. Marcus's congressional testimony continued with details that brought the photograph into sharp focus. In early 1889, Thomas Whitmore had confronted his father about the peonage system. According to Marcus's account, the confrontation had been explosive. Thomas told his father that what he was doing was illegal and immoral. Marcus testified. He said that slavery had ended, and it was time to let me and the others go. Mr. William Whitmore, the elder, he laughed. He said the law was whatever powerful men decided it was, and that no court would take the word of colored workers over his. But Thomas hadn't given up. He spent months secretly copying his father's business records. The fraudulent contracts, the ledgers showing wages that were never paid, the manufactured debts that kept workers trapped. He consulted with a lawyer in Richmond, a man named Robert Pemberton, who had been involved in civil rights cases. Thomas came to me in August 1889, Marcus testified. He told me he had evidence that would free me and compensate me for years of stolen wages, but he said it would be dangerous. His father was a powerful man with powerful friends. If we moved forward with a legal case, there would be consequences. Marcus had told Thomas to proceed anyway. Freedom, even with risk, was better than continued bondage. On September 10, 1889, Thomas filed his counterclaim against his father, accusing him of maintaining illegal peonage and submitting the copied documents as evidence. William Whitmore was furious. Marcus testified. He told Thomas he was betraying his family, destroying their name, siding with colored people over his own blood. But Thomas stood firm. He said his conscience couldn't allow him to benefit from my slavery. 4 days later, on September 14th, Thomas took Marcus to Richmond to have their photograph made. It was a deliberate act, Marcus explained. Visual proof of their friendship, of Thomas's commitment to treating Marcus as an equal. The identical suits, the companionable positioning, the choice of Anderson & Sons photography, the same studio that photographed Richmond's elite families. All of it was meant to make a statement. Thomas wanted the world to know he stood with me, Marcus said. He wanted a record that couldn't be erased or denied. But Marcus also testified about what wasn't visible in the photograph, the fear they both felt. Thomas had received threats from his father's associates. Marcus had been warned by other workers that William Whitmore was planning something. They both knew that powerful men didn't easily surrender their power, and that justice for black workers was rare in 1889 Virginia. The inscription on the back of the photograph, "May God forgive us for what we have done," took on new meaning in light of Marcus's testimony. Thomas knew that filing the case against his father would have consequences. He was asking for forgiveness, not for something immoral, but for the family betrayal his act of justice required. Marcus's testimony then addressed Thomas's death. His voice, even filtered through the formal language of congressional records, carried grief that resonated across more than a century. On October 2, 1889, I was working in the carpentry shop at Oakwood. Thomas had moved into the overseer's cottage to distance himself from his father. That evening, I heard a gunshot from the main house. I ran toward the sound and found Thomas lying in his father's study. There was blood, and Thomas was barely conscious. He looked at me and whispered, "Run, Marcus. Papers, desk. Run." Marcus testified that William Whitmore arrived seconds later with the sheriff. They immediately accused Marcus of shooting Thomas, of attempted murder. Marcus ran, knowing he would be lynched if he stayed. He hid in the woods near the plantation, and that night, under cover of darkness, he crept back to the overseer's cottage. I found the papers Thomas had mentioned. Marcus testified. Legal documents signed by a judge ordering my release from all contracts and awarding me compensation for back wages. Thomas had obtained them that very day. He had freed me on paper, and his father had killed him for it. Marcus took the documents and fled. He walked at night and hid during the day, making his way north through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. He arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on his back and the legal papers that proved his freedom. Thomas Whitmore died because he believed I deserved to be free. Marcus told the Congressional Committee. He gave up his inheritance, his family, and ultimately his life because he couldn't accept that I was still enslaved. I carry that debt every day. James sat back from his laptop, overwhelmed by the weight of Marcus's testimony. The photograph wasn't just documentation of friendship. It was Thomas's last gift to Marcus, proof of their bond and of Thomas's commitment to justice. The fear in both their eyes wasn't paranoia. It was prescient knowledge that their act of defiance would have terrible consequences. Thomas had been murdered by his father, and William Whitmore had used his power to cover it up. Buying the sheriff's cooperation, ensuring the doctor signed a false death certificate, keeping the newspapers from investigating. Thomas's accidental shooting had been nothing of the kind, but Marcus had survived to tell the truth. He had escaped, built a life, and eventually found the courage to publicly testify about what happened at Oakwood. His testimony before Congress had been part of a larger investigation into peonage that led to some reforms, though enforcement remained weak for decades. James needed to find out what happened to Marcus after his testimony, and he needed to learn whether Marcus had any descendants who might still have the documents Thomas had given him, including, perhaps, the original photograph. James contacted the National Archives to request any additional documents related to Marcus Freeman's 1902 congressional testimony. While waiting for their response, he continued tracing Marcus's life through Philadelphia records. The 1910 census showed Marcus and Sarah Freeman still living on South Street, now with 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 13. Marcus's carpentry business had expanded. He employed 3 workers and owned the building where his shop operated. His success was remarkable, given that he had arrived in Philadelphia penniless just 19 years earlier. James found articles about Marcus in the Philadelphia Tribune throughout the 1900s and 1910s. He had become a prominent figure in the city's black community, serving on the board of the First Baptist Church, advocating for workers' rights, supporting education initiatives. In 1915, he gave a speech at the dedication of a new school, talking about the importance of education as a tool for freedom. But it was a 1925 article that caught James's attention. The Tribune had published a feature story about successful black business owners in Philadelphia, including a long profile of Marcus Freeman. The article mentioned that Marcus kept in his office documents from his past that remind him daily of the cost of freedom. James needed to find those documents. If they still existed, they might include Thomas Whitmore's legal papers, letters, perhaps even the original copy of the photograph. He searched for Marcus's death record and found it in the 1935 Philadelphia Vital Records. Marcus Freeman had died on July 12, 1935 at age 70. His obituary in the Tribune was extensive, detailing his business accomplishments and community service. It mentioned that he was survived by his wife Sarah, 4 children, and 9 grandchildren. James began the painstaking work of tracing Marcus's descendants. The oldest child, a son named Thomas Freeman, named undoubtedly after Thomas Whitmore, had become a teacher in Philadelphia's public schools. James found records of Thomas Freeman teaching at multiple schools between 1925 and 1960. The younger son, William Freeman, had moved to New York and worked as a postal clerk. The 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Dorothy, had both married and remained in Philadelphia. Dorothy Freeman Hayes. The name clicked in James's mind. That was the name on the donation letter. The estate sale in Richmond had come from Dorothy Hayes, Marcus Freeman's daughter. James pulled out the original donation letter and read it again with new understanding. Dorothy Hayes had died at 97, which meant she had been born around 1927, making her Marcus's granddaughter, not his daughter. The letter said her home had been full of historical documents and photographs that had never been explained. Marcus's granddaughter had inherited his papers and kept them for decades without knowing their significance. And when she died, they had ended up in an estate sale, eventually making their way to James's desk at the museum. He immediately called the executor of Dorothy Hayes's estate, a lawyer named Jennifer Park. Ms. Park. This is James Rivera from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You sent us a donation from Dorothy Hayes's estate. I need to know if there were other items in her home, papers, documents, photographs that weren't included in the donation. Jennifer Park sounded surprised. There were several boxes of papers, yes. We donated what we thought was historically significant, but there were boxes of family documents that seemed more personal. Letters, business records, legal papers. Those were set aside for possible family members, but we haven't located any living relatives yet. Those papers might be crucial, James said, his heart racing. They could include documents related to a major historical case about peonage and illegal labor practices. Would it be possible for me to examine them? Jennifer agreed to meet him at her office in Richmond the following day. James immediately booked a flight and called Patricia to share the news. Dorothy Hayes was Marcus Freeman's granddaughter, he explained. She had his papers, and they might include the documents Thomas Whitmore died to give him. This is incredible, Patricia said. 135 years later, and we're finally going to see the evidence that Thomas Whitmore gathered against his father. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Marcus Freeman, walking hundreds of miles to freedom, carrying legal papers that had cost his friend's life. Marcus had kept those documents for decades, passing them to his children and grandchildren, preserving evidence of both injustice and heroism. And now, through an unlikely chain of circumstances, those documents were about to reveal their secrets. Jennifer Park's office in Richmond was in a renovated Victorian building not far from where Anderson & Sons Photography had once operated. She led James to a storage room where 5 cardboard boxes sat on a table, each labeled with Dorothy Hayes's name. These are the personal papers, Jennifer explained. Family letters, some business documents from a carpentry business. I assumed that was her grandfather's, and various legal papers. I didn't examine them closely because they seemed like private family materials. James pulled on archival gloves and opened the first box. Inside were letters, sorted into bundles and tied with ribbon. He carefully untied one bundle and began reading. They were letters from Marcus Freeman to his children, written between 1920 and 1935. The handwriting was educated and clear. Evidence of the literacy Elizabeth Whitmore had secretly taught him as a child. Many of the letters contained advice about business, family, and life, but one letter, written to his son Thomas Freeman in 1929, addressed the past directly. My son, you bear the name of the bravest man I ever knew. Thomas Whitmore was more than a friend to me. He was my brother in all but blood, and he gave his life so that I could be free. I have told you the story many times, but I want you to have it in writing so that you can tell your children, and they can tell theirs. The truth must not die with me. The letter went on to recount the story Marcus had told in his congressional testimony, but with more personal detail. Memories of growing up with Thomas, of Elizabeth Whitmore teaching them to read in secret, of Thomas's horror when he discovered his father was still holding Marcus in illegal bondage. James photographed each page carefully, then moved to the second box. This one contained business records from Marcus's carpentry business, ledgers showing income and expenses, contracts for building projects, employee records. Marcus had been meticulous in his record-keeping, perhaps a reflection of how fraudulent records had once been used to enslave him. The third box held what James was looking for. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and time, were legal documents from 1889. James's hands trembled as he carefully unrolled them. The first document was a court order dated October 2, 1889, the day Thomas died. It was signed by Judge Robert Chambers of the Richmond Circuit Court and ordered the immediate release of Marcus Freeman from all labor contracts with William Whitmore. The document declared the contracts fraudulent and awarded Marcus $500 in back wages, the same amount mentioned in William Whitmore's probate file. The second document was an affidavit signed by Thomas Whitmore, detailing the evidence he had gathered. Copies of fraudulent contracts, ledgers showing unpaid wages, testimony from other workers who had been trapped in peonage. Thomas's handwriting was confident and clear, his language precise. He concluded the affidavit with words that brought tears to James's eyes. "I submit this evidence, not as a son betraying his father, but as a citizen upholding the law, and as a friend honoring the humanity of Marcus Freeman, who has suffered years of illegal bondage at my family's hands. If there is shame in this testimony, it belongs to those who maintain such systems, not to those who expose them. I am prepared to accept any consequences that come from speaking this truth." James sat back, overwhelmed. Thomas had known the risk. He had filed these papers knowing his father might retaliate, and he had done it anyway, because Marcus's freedom was worth more than his own safety. The third document was a copy of the photograph, not the original. That was the one James had found in the donation, but a second print with a note attached in Thomas's handwriting. To Marcus, "This photograph was taken so that no one can deny our friendship or question my sincerity in advocating for your freedom. We stand as equals here as we should stand under the law. If something happens to me, use this evidence to prove the truth. Your friend always, Thomas Whitmore." September 14, 1889. James photographed everything, his mind racing with the implications. Thomas had prepared for his own death. He had given Marcus not just legal documents freeing him, but evidence to prove what had really happened if William Whitmore tried to cover it up. The fourth box contained newspaper clippings Marcus had saved, articles about peonage, about labor rights, about the slow progress toward justice, and buried among them was a brittle newspaper clipping from a Richmond paper, dated November 1912. The headline read, "William Whitmore, prominent planter, dies at 78. Marcus had saved his enslaver's obituary." James read it and found it was the typical laudatory piece about a respected citizen and successful businessman. There was no mention of Thomas's death, no mention of peonage, no hint of the truth. William Whitmore had died with his reputation intact, his crime unpunished. But Marcus had known, and Marcus had made sure the evidence survived. The fifth box contained personal items, Marcus's Bible, a pocket watch, and a small leather journal. James opened the journal carefully. It was a diary Marcus had kept from 1890 to 1900, documenting his new life in Philadelphia. The first entry, dated January 15, 1890, began, "I am free. Thomas died to make it so, and I will not waste the gift he gave me. Today, I begin my life as a truly free man." James read through entries describing Marcus's arrival in Philadelphia, his struggle to find work, his determination to build something meaningful with his freedom. There were entries about meeting Sarah, about starting his carpentry business, about the birth of his children, and scattered throughout were entries about Thomas. June 12, 1891. Today would have been Thomas's 25th birthday. I think of him often and wonder what he would have become if he had lived. A lawyer perhaps, fighting for justice, or a teacher like his mother. He had a good heart, rare in a world that often rewards cruelty. September 14, 1895. 6 years ago today, Thomas and I had our photograph made. I look at it sometimes and remember his courage. He knew what his father might do, and he moved forward anyway. I try to live my life in a way that honors his sacrifice. October 6, 1900. 11 years since Thomas died. My son Thomas is learning to read. I teach him every night, the way Thomas's mother taught us. I tell him about the man whose name he carries and why courage matters more than comfort. James closed the journal, deeply moved. Marcus had never forgotten. He had carried Thomas's memory for nearly half a century, passing the story to his children, preserving the evidence, ensuring that both the injustice and the heroism would be remembered. James spent 2 days in Richmond, carefully documenting every item from Dorothy Hayes's estate. With Jennifer Park's permission and assistance, he arranged for the documents to be professionally preserved and eventually donated to the National Museum, where they would be available to researchers and the public. But James had one more task. He needed to find living descendants of Marcus Freeman and tell them the story. He also wanted to find descendants of Thomas Whitmore, if any existed, so they could know the truth about their ancestors' courage and sacrifice. Patricia helped him trace the Freeman family line. Marcus's son Thomas had 3 children, one of whom, Marcus Freeman II, had become a civil rights lawyer in the 1960s. Marcus Sippa had 2 daughters, both still living. Patricia found contact information for the older daughter, Dr. Alicia Freeman, a retired professor of African American history living in Oakland, California. James called her, his heart pounding. Dr. Freeman, my name is James Rivera. I'm a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I've been researching your great-great-grandfather, Marcus Freeman, and I've discovered some remarkable documents about his life and his friendship with a man named Thomas Whitmore. There was a long pause. Then Alicia Freeman said, her voice thick with emotion, Thomas Whitmore. I know that name. My grandfather, Marcus Freeman II, told me stories about him when I was a child. He said Thomas Whitmore was the reason our family was free, the reason we existed at all. But we never had proof, never had documents, just stories passed down through generations. I have the proof, James said. I have the legal documents Thomas Whitmore filed to free your great-great-grandfather. I have an affidavit he wrote, a photograph they took together, and your great-great-grandfather's diary describing their friendship and Thomas's sacrifice. Would you like to see them? Alicia Freeman flew to Washington 3 days later. James met her at the museum with Patricia, and they spent an afternoon going through the documents. Alicia examined each item with the care of a historian and the emotion of a descendant learning her family's full story for the first time. When she saw the photograph, her great-great-grandfather's young face, the fear in his eyes, but also the strength, standing beside the white man who would die to free him, she wept openly. We always knew Marcus Freeman was brave, she said. We knew he escaped and built a life, but I never fully understood how he got free or what it cost. Thomas Whitmore, he was just a name in family stories, almost mythical. But this, she gestured at the documents, this makes him real. It makes his sacrifice real. James showed her the letter Thomas had written on the back of the photograph. If something happens to me, Use this evidence to prove the truth. He showed her Marcus's diary entries, the decades of remembering and honoring Thomas's memory. They loved each other, Alicia said, not in a romantic way, but as brothers. The system tried to make them enslaver and enslaved, but they refused to accept those roles. They insisted on being friends, equals, even when it cost Thomas everything. James then addressed what might be a sensitive question. Dr. Freeman, I'd like to create an exhibition about this story, about Marcus and Thomas, about peonage, about the courage it took to stand against injustice. Would you and your family be comfortable with that? Comfortable? Alicia laughed, wiping her eyes. It would be an honor. This story needs to be told. People need to understand that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just took different forms. And people need to know about individuals like Thomas Whitmore. White people who actually put their lives on the line for justice, not just their comfort or their reputation. Over the next weeks, James worked with Alicia and other Freeman family members to plan the exhibition. They decided to title it The Photograph, that testified a story of friendship, courage, and the fight against peonage. But James still wanted to find Thomas Whitmore's descendants. William Whitmore's line was easy to trace. He had a daughter from a second marriage who had children and grandchildren. But James wondered if those descendants knew the truth about their ancestor, or if they had grown up believing the sanitized version of William Whitmore as a respected planter. Patricia found a descendant named Robert Whitmore, a retired attorney living in Alexandria, Virginia. He was William Whitmore's great-great-grandson. James contacted him cautiously, unsure how he would react to learning that his ancestor had murdered his own son and maintained illegal peonage. Robert Whitmore agreed to meet. When James told him the story, showing him the documents, the photograph, Marcus's testimony, Robert sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. My family always said Thomas died in a hunting accident. We were told he was the favorite son, that his death devastated my great-great-grandfather. There were hints of some kind of conflict between them, but nothing specific. He looked at the affidavit, at Thomas's clear handwriting. This explains so much. How do you feel about it? James asked carefully. Robert met his eyes. Ashamed that William Whitmore was my ancestor. Proud that Thomas Whitmore was. I never knew him, but I'm grateful he did the right thing, even though it cost him everything. And I'm grateful to Marcus Freeman for preserving Thomas's memory, for making sure the truth survived. He paused, then continued. My family benefited from wealth built on enslaved labor and illegal peonage. That's a hard truth to face, but pretending it didn't happen or making excuses for it would be worse. I'd like to be part of telling this story, if you'll let me. Thomas Whitmore should be remembered as the man he was. Someone who chose justice over family loyalty, who saw Marcus Freeman's humanity when others refused to. 6 months later, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened. The photograph that testified. The exhibition occupied a prominent gallery, and lines formed before the doors opened on the first day. The centerpiece was the photograph itself, displayed at eye level with professional lighting that revealed every detail. The fear in both men's eyes, the tight grip of Thomas's hand, Marcus's clenched fist, the chain barely visible in the background. Beside it was Thomas's note. "We stand as equals here, as we should stand under the law." The exhibition told the complete story through documents, letters, and contextual information. It explained the system of peonage that trapped thousands of black workers after slavery officially ended. It showed copies of the fraudulent contracts Marcus had been forced to sign, the court order that freed him, Thomas's affidavit against his father, One section of the exhibition focused on Thomas Whitmore's decision and its consequences. Visitors could read his affidavit, see the newspaper reports of his accidental death, and understand the courage it took to testify against his own father in 1889 Virginia. The exhibition didn't present Thomas as a perfect savior figure, but as a complicated person who had grown up benefiting from slavery and peonage, recognized the injustice, and chose to act despite the cost. Another section documented Marcus Freeman's life after escape, his journey to Philadelphia, his carpentry business, his advocacy work, his congressional testimony. Visitors could see pages from his diary, letters to his children, and newspaper articles about his success. The exhibition showed that freedom, once gained, could lead to remarkable achievements. A video played continuously in which Alicia Freeman and other descendants told family stories about Marcus, explained how his legacy had influenced their lives, and reflected on what it meant to know the full truth about their ancestors' path to freedom. Robert Whitmore also participated, recording a video in which he acknowledged his ancestors' crimes and honored Thomas Whitmore's courage. "Facing difficult family history isn't easy," he said in the video, "but it's necessary. We can't change what our ancestors did, but we can choose how we remember them and how we act in our own lives." Thomas Whitmore made the right choice in 1889, even though it cost him everything. The least I can do is make sure his choice is remembered and honored. The exhibition also included a section on the broader context of peonage, showing how systems of debt bondage, convict leasing, and sharecropping had maintained conditions similar to slavery for decades after emancipation. It included testimony from other survivors, legal documents from peonage cases, and information about the slow, incomplete progress toward justice. On opening day, James stood in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He saw people lean close to the photograph, studying the faces of Marcus and Thomas. He saw them read the documents with growing understanding and anger. He saw parents explain to children what peonage meant and why Thomas's sacrifice mattered. Alicia Freeman stood beside him. "My great-great-grandfather would be proud," she said quietly. He kept these documents for over 40 years, passing them to his children, preserving the evidence. He wanted people to know the truth, and now, 135 years after that photograph was taken, people are finally listening. A young black woman approached them, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for this," she said. "I never knew about peonage. I thought slavery just ended in 1865 and that was it. This, seeing the actual contracts, the ways they trap people, it helps me understand why freedom took so much longer than emancipation." An elderly white man stopped to talk to Robert Whitmore, who was volunteering as a docent for the day. "My family was from Virginia, too," the man said. "My grandfather probably knew families like yours. This exhibition made me wonder what my ancestors might have done, what they might have been complicit in. It's uncomfortable, but important." Throughout the day, visitors engaged with the exhibition deeply, taking time to read every document, watching the videos multiple times, sitting with the weight of what they were learning. The photograph that had seemed to show simple friendship revealed itself to be a complex testimony to courage, injustice, and the bonds that could transcend the dehumanizing systems of racism. As the museum prepared to close that evening, James walked through the gallery one more time. He stopped in front of the photograph, looking at the two young men frozen in time. Marcus Freeman, who would survive to build a remarkable life and preserve the truth for future generations, and Thomas Whitmore, who would die for justice just 18 days after this image was captured. The inscription Thomas had written echoed in James's mind. "If something happens to me, use this evidence to prove the truth. Thomas had known he might die. He had prepared for it, ensuring that Marcus would have legal proof of his freedom and evidence of what really happened. And Marcus had honored that trust, carrying the documents hundreds of miles, preserving them through decades, passing them to his children with the instruction to remember. The photograph had been taken as evidence, visual testimony that Marcus Freeman and Thomas Whitmore stood as equals, that their friendship was real, that Thomas's commitment to justice was genuine. For 135 years, it had waited in albums and boxes, passed through generations, finally arriving at James's desk through a chain of circumstances that seemed almost miraculous. Now the photograph had fulfilled its purpose. The truth it documented had been revealed, believed, and given the honor it deserved. Marcus Freeman and Thomas Whitmore, one black, one white, both victims of a system that tried to make them enemies, but who insisted on being friends, had left a legacy that transcended their own era. Their story would inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, justice over loyalty to unjust systems, and the recognition of common humanity over the artificial divisions of race. The photograph, once an innocent image that hid a dark secret, had become a powerful symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and the possibility of solidarity across racial lines. As visitors filed past the image, seeing it clearly for the first time in more than a century, James thought about all the other photographs, waiting to be examined, all the other stories hidden in plain sight, all the other truths that deserve to be uncovered and honored. The work of remembering, truthfully, completely, courageously, would continue, and James was grateful to be part of it.